Hi everyone, this is day 2 of reading The Lottery by Shirley Jackson. Let's go ahead and get into a quick recap before we start reading. So yesterday we read about the exposition of the story, and we talked about and read about the tradition of the lottery. We don't know what that means just yet, but we also get some background information about the village this is set in, when the lottery takes place, the roles of men and women in this community, and I think we get a brief description of what the black box looks like as far as the lottery is concerned. So, we know that this village is small, it's about 300 people, and they are assembling for the lottery that takes place in the town square. And this is led by Mr. Summers, who's kind of in charge of a lot of the civic activities, which just means any activities that involve the public. He also owns his own coal business, and he's described as being a pretty happy, round-faced man, which is in line with the description we get of men in this community just in general. So as we talked last class, men are in positions of power in this community. They're in charge. They are the ones that hold the jobs and make the money in the community. They are seen as more lively, right? We get descriptions of them joking and smiling. We have just a description of Mr. Summers himself being a happy, round-faced man. And like I said, they are the ones that are in charge in this community. And then we get a description of women, which is a little more negative. Sorry, girls, I know it sucks. We have, women are described as being gossipy. They work in the home. They're described as, wearing faded clothing, so which makes them kind of faded, maybe a little boring. They're nags and they scold people. So women are kind of the opposite of men in this community, and they're also inferior to men, which means that they kind of fall below men in the hierarchy or the chain of command in this community. Which is another thing I want to talk about. So if we were to look at the hierarchy, or who's on top in this community and who's on bottom, it would be structured something like this. So obviously men would be on top because, again, they're in positions of power. Then, generally speaking, women would come after men, right? And then it would be children. However, I want you to note something too. Male children come after men and before their mothers because they are men. So even young male children have more of a say in this community than grown women do. And then obviously young girls who are still children are the very last in our chain of command, right? Or in our hierarchy in this community. So women definitely hold an inferior position, which means that they are expendable. And expendable means they are easily gotten rid of, and it doesn't matter if they've been rid of. So not looking too good for the women in this community, and I want you to keep that in mind. We also, obviously the lottery has been mentioned several times, and we don't get a lot of information on the lottery, just that this has been a long-standing tradition since they set up the community and to begin with when the village was first settled in. And we also know that a black box is involved, and I think that we talked about that. In the same paragraph, when we're introduced to Mr. Summers, we're also introduced to the black box, and the black box is a part of the lottery. So let's go ahead and reread this last paragraph on the first page, so we can kind of refresh our memories here as far as the black box goes. So the lottery was conducted, as were the square dances, the teen club, the Halloween program, by Mr. Summers, who had time and energy to devote to civic activities. He was a round-faced, jovial man, and he ran the coal business, and people were sorry for him because he had no children and his wife was a scold. When he arrived in the square carrying the black wooden box, there was a murmur of conversation among the villagers, and he waved and called, "Little late today, folks." The postmaster, Mr. Graves, followed him, carrying a three-legged stool, and the stool was put in the center of the square, and Mr. Summers set the black box down on it. The villagers kept their distance, leaving a space between themselves and the stool, and when Mr. Summers said, "Some of you fellows want to give me a hand," there was a hesitation before two men, Mr. Martin and his oldest son, Baxter, came forward to hold the box steady on the stool, while Mr. Summers stood up the papers inside. Okay, so already we know immediately that the villagers in this community are very wary of the black box. Like they're afraid of it. They won't even go near it, right? They're keeping their distance and leaving space between themselves and the black box. They're hesitant to even go near it, right? It took a little bit before two people volunteered to go up and help hold the stool down while Mr. Summers stirred the papers inside the box. So we know immediately that the box is not necessarily well received in the community. There's some fear surrounding the box. They're cautious around it. So let's go ahead and continue and get into more of a description of what the box is like. If my little mouse thing will let me scroll. Come on. There it goes. Okay. The original paraphernalia for the lottery had been lost long ago, and the black box now resting on the stool had been put into use even before Old Man Warner, the oldest man in town, was born. Mr. Summers spoke frequently to the villagers about making a new box, but no one liked to upset even as much tradition as was represented by the black box. There was a story that the present box had been made with some pieces of the box that had preceded it, the one that had been constructed when the first people settled down to make a village here. Every year after the lottery, Mr. Summers began talking again about a new box, but every year the subject was allowed to fade off without anything being done. The black box grew shabbier each year. By now it was no longer completely black, but splintered badly along one side to show the original wood color, and in some places faded or stained. Okay, so we get a pretty descriptive idea of what the box looks like, and there's a reason for this, right? They don't just toss in a description of this box for no reason. The author is very particular and specific about what information we get, right? It's a short story. They have to be. Otherwise, it would be a novel, right? And we can put in however much detail we wanted. So the fact that this black box has a whole paragraph to itself of description is important, and we're going to talk about why. So obviously, like we said, the lottery is a tradition that's been taking place in the community since the community was established, right? And they even say too, that the one that had been constructed when the first people settled down to make the village here, right? So the lottery is as old as the village is, and the box is as old as the village is, right? Because the box and the lottery kind of go hand in hand. You can't have one without the other. We don't really know what the connection is just yet, but we will get to that soon. Anyway, so we know the black box that we have now is not the original, right? Because that's how old this tradition is. So the first black box ended up getting so old to where they couldn't use it anymore. So now they have a new one, and there's rumors going around that the box they have now is made up of pieces from the old one, and we also know that this box is also kind of standing on its last leg, right? We get descriptions of it being faded and shabby and worn out, right? Stained. We can see the original wood color, so we know that this box has been around for a very long time too. So that's important, right? This is establishing, first of all, how old the village is, and also how old this tradition is. So let's go ahead and continue. Mr. Martin and his oldest son, Baxter, held the black box securely on the stool. Mr. Summers had stirred the papers thoroughly with his hand. Because so much of the ritual had been forgotten or discarded, Mr. Summers had been successful in having slips of paper substituted for the chips of wood that had been used for generations. Chips of wood, Mr. Summers had argued, had been all very well when the village was tiny, but now the population was more than 300 and likely to keep on growing. It was necessary to use something that would fit more easily in the box. The night before the lottery, Mr. Summers and Mr. Graves made up slips of paper and put them in the box, and it was then taken to the safe of Mr. Summers' coal company and locked up until Mr. Summers was ready to take it to the square the next morning. The rest of the year, the box was put away, sometimes one place, sometimes another. It had spent 1 year in Mr. Graves' barn, and another year underfoot in the post office, and sometimes it was set on a shelf in the Martin grocery and left there. So, we also know that this tradition is so long-lasting that they have either forgotten some of the ritual, and remember, ritual is a specific ceremony that has a certain order of things, right? There's a particular way that it has to go. So, for example, if you're Catholic or know of the Catholic tradition of taking communion, right, that is a religious ceremony. And you're supposed to eat the body of Christ, the bread or the cracker or whatever it is, before you drink the blood of Christ, which is the juice or the wine or whatever, right? Those of you that are not familiar with religious practices, let me think of a better example of a ritual. The ritual of, I don't know, if you play a sport, right, and you have it in your head that if you do this exact thing every single time, before you go up to bat, let's say if you play baseball, like if you knock the bat against your right foot then your left, that's a ritual that you practice, that you do in that order specifically because you believe it'll make you hit the ball harder, right, or whatever it is. That's also a ritual that, to give you an example. So, anyway, this tradition is so old that some of the ritual has been forgotten or discarded, right? And they can't use pieces of wood anymore, as they described, because the community is so big now they have to use pieces of paper. So, we're just getting some more background information about the lottery itself. Also, before we move on, I want to talk to you about what the lottery means in this situation. So, obviously, in our society, the lottery is where you can go in, buy a lottery ticket or a scratch-off ticket, and hopefully you win that big sum of money, right? Or at least a sum of money. Otherwise, you're out like $2 or however much you're putting down to buy that lottery ticket. It's a game of chance, right? You're taking a chance on winning, you're taking a chance on losing. Now, in this situation, the lottery is also a quote-unquote game of chance, but you don't really win anything in this situation, and we'll see what I mean by that when we continue reading. Okay. We also know that this box is very well kept after because it's so a part of the tradition. So it kind of makes its way around the community, so that it doesn't get lost. Okay, here we go, that's better. There was a great deal of fussing to be done before Mr. Summers declared the lottery open. There were the lists to make up of head of families, heads of households in each family, members of each household in each family. There was a proper swearing in of Mr. Summers by the postmaster as the official of the lottery. At one time, some people remembered, there had been a recital of some sort, performed by the official of the lottery, a perfunctory, tuneless chant that had been rattled off duly each year. Some people believe that the official of the lottery used to stand just so when he said or sang it. Others believed that it was supposed to walk among the people. But years and years ago, this part of the ritual had been allowed to lapse. There had been also a ritual salute, which the official of the lottery had to use in addressing each person who came up to draw from the box, but this also had changed with time. Until now, it felt necessary only for the official to speak to each person approaching Mr. Summers was very good at all of this. In his clean white shirt and blue jeans, with one hand resting carelessly on the black box, he seemed very proper and important as he talked interminably to Mr. Graves and the Martins. Okay. So we get a lot of information in this paragraph. And essentially, this is just breaking down the traditions that they've kept, or I'm sorry, the part of the ritual in this tradition of the lottery that they've kept and what they've gotten rid of, right? So we know that part of the ritual includes making a list of the head of families. So who is in charge of each family and how many members are in each family. So think of your own family, right? Maybe your dad is considered the head of the family and there are 5 of you all together. So they have to make a list of your dad's name and then also all of you together. So that makes 5 in the family, and your dad will be the one to come up and draw from the box for each person. Okay? They said that there's a swearing in that they still do of Mr. Summers as the official of the lottery. And then they start talking about how they got rid of a recital, which just means Mr. Summers would have had to recite maybe a song or some kind of chant before the lottery began, but they got rid of that, right? And they couldn't agree on whether or not he stood in a certain place or if he walked among the people. But it doesn't matter because they got rid of it, right? Another thing they got rid of was the salute